to Lesson 1 of Bass Clef Bootcamp. Today, we're going to be covering some fundamentals before we dive deeper into more advanced topics in the coming lessons. These things may already be familiar to you through your prior experience with reading music, but we're going to review these basics to make sure we're all moving forward on even footing. First, we'll start with our landmark notes, which are kind of the safety net we can always fall back on while we're reading. Then we'll look at directional reading and how that can help us improve our accuracy, followed by our first two intervals, seconds and thirds. And finally, we'll zoom in on one section of the bass clef to make sure those notes are really familiar to use before we expand to bigger sections of the clef later on. A topic we will cover a lot in this bootcamp is recognizing our landmark notes. These are notes that help us find our way around the staff more quickly, and if we ever get stuck while we're reading, we always have these as a reference point to help us move on more quickly. We want to be able to recognize these notes instantly and accurately every single time we see them. Of course, we hope to get to that point with all of our notes in our learning journey, but these three notes are an excellent way to get started. The landmark notes that we use in the bass clef are also repeated in the treble clef, making them a practical way to recognize notes all the way across the grand staff. Our first note in the bass clef is F. This is the F directly below middle C, and we sometimes hear the bass clef referred to as the F clef, because the F is the central reference point in this clef. Here, we see it highlighted in blue, and note that this F line is the line that runs between the two dots in the bass clef. With this clue, we should be able to identify this note instantly every time we see it. I mentioned before that our landmark notes are repeated in the treble clef, and here we see that the landmark F in the treble clef is the top line. Our second landmark note is C, and we actually have this landmark note twice in the bass clef. One is, of course, middle C, which is always easy to recognize because of its little ledger line, and the other is the C one octave lower, here highlighted in yellow. If you have trouble memorizing the position of this landmark note, you can highlight this space in the exercises in your workbook to help you burn this image into your mind's eye. Here, we see our landmark Cs in the treble clef as well. The treble clef also has two Cs. One is once again middle C, this time facing upward in the treble clef. These middle Cs are of course the same note on the piano. They're only notated differently to show us which hand should be playing. Middle C in the bass clef will typically be played with the left hand, while middle C in the treble clef is usually played by the right hand. Our final landmark note for today is the low G in the bass clef. This is visually easy to identify because it is the lowest line in the clef. The treble clef G intersects the clef symbol and makes a sort of target. Much like F in the bass clef, we can refer to the treble clef as the G clef because of the importance of this landmark note. Here, we see all the landmark notes we talked about in this lesson. As you can see, they are well spaced across the grand staff, and no matter where a note is located, we are never far from one of these reference points. When we combine these landmark notes with other topics we will cover in this lesson and in the entire bootcamp, it creates an incredibly reliable method for reading music. Also, note the symmetry that we find with these landmark notes. Both clefs use G, C, F to help us find our way. In the bass clef beginning with the lowest line, and in the treble clef finishing with the uppermost line. Invest time in memorizing these notes and watch your reading skills start to take off. It's really just a simple system, but it makes a big impact. So let's practice. For today, I will name each of the notes in this excerpt with a pause in between each note. Follow along and see if you can name each note before I do. So our first note here is F, G, C, 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 G, C, G, F, C, F, C, G, F, C, 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 F, C, G, F, G, C, F, G, C, C, F, C, C, C. Now, let's practice with this example taken from your sight reading exercises. This should be a bit easier to follow, simply because the pattern is more systematic and not just randomly selected notes. Because of this, I'll go a bit faster this time. Ready? Go. G, C, F, C, F, C, G, and another G tied to that one. C, F, C, G, C, F, C, and long and tied to another C. G, C, F, C, F, C, G, C, F, C, C, F, C, G, 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 G. Now let's move on to directional reading. This may seem ridiculously oversimplified, but it would surprise you how many students I have seen who don't actively think about the direction their notes are moving. If we spend 1 or 2 lessons honing in this skill, it will increase our reading accuracy and help us read more fluidly. Because at the end of the day, all music goes up, down, or stays the same, and we want to be able to recognize these changes with 100% accuracy. So in this example, we can see that we start with our landmark G, we move up until the second measure, where we then have 3 Ds in a row. This pattern goes back and forth between D and C, finally stepping back down to G in the 5th measure. Then we move back up, have repeated notes again, step back down almost all the way to G, go back up once, and finally skip back down to G to finish. Over the course of the boot camp, we have a few exercises in which we need to indicate the direction of motions with arrows. It's fine to use long arrows when there are many notes in a row going in the same direction. This method also helps us practice moving our eyes forward while we read. We're taking our skills from reading one note at a time to reading in longer thoughts. Much like reading a language, we start out reading each letter, putting them together, and sounding out what each word is. But we don't want to stay at that level forever. We want to start identifying collections of letters as words and collections of words as sentences, and being able to read larger sections of music in this same way. Here's another example. Feel free to pause this video for a moment if you want to scan through the notes and think about the direction of the motion. On the next slide, there will be arrows like we had before, showing you which way the notes are moving. This is where the magic starts to happen. Landmark notes are super important for finding our orientation. Directional reading is often underrated, but also irreplaceable. But when we combine those with using intervals to help us, we really start to read more fluently and more organically. Intervals are just how we measure distance in music. There are several labels we can apply to our intervals, but for the sake of reading music at this stage, we're just going to be using the most basic terms. We'll dive into more specifics later on. First up, we have seconds. They're called seconds because we move from our first note over to a second neighboring note. Our first notes here are G and A, so G is the first note and A is a second higher. From A, we move 1 second higher to B. From B, we move 1 second higher to C, and so on. Because seconds move in a stair-step fashion, we can also call them steps. Intervals can of course move upwards or downwards, so if you look at the last note on this slide, G, and then at the previous note, F, we move down 1 second. When these notes are played one after the other, we call it a melodic interval. Intervals can also be played simultaneously, or harmonically as we call it in music. Seconds look quite funny when they're played harmonically. Because there's no other way to make space for both note heads, one of the notes always has to point in the opposite direction from how it would usually be notated. Don't let this confuse you, the notes themselves remain the same. So here, for example, our first group is G and A, the second group is B and C, followed by D and E, then F and G. The interval of a third, then, refers to a distance of 3 notes. We start here on our first note, G, we skip over the second note, A, and we play the third note, B. Because thirds always skip over exactly one note, we can also refer to these as skips. Here we see more thirds, but this time from notes that fall in the spaces. Remember, when we have thirds, we're skipping from line to line or space to space. So here we have A, C, E, G, B, and you can, of course, use these to help you practice naming thirds throughout the musical alphabet as well. Here we see the same thirds on lines from before, just now written harmonically. And here the same thing for thirds that fall in the spaces in the bass clef. So all of that is great as a visual exercise, but how does that translate into our playing? Well, here we have the chance to combine three topics we've covered so far today. We start on our bass clef landmark G. We recognize that the notes are first moving upwards, and this motion isn't stepping. We're only moving in thirds in the first measure. The motion from the first measure into the next is a second moving up, then the same note repeated 2 times. We haven't learned the interval from that C to the G in the next measure yet, but that doesn't actually matter because we instantly recognize our landmark G, and so on. The other thing to keep in mind, when we're playing these exercises and melodies, we can of course try to consciously name the notes as we go. After all, we're only playing one note at a time at this stage, and it's a great exercise for really securing our knowledge of the bass clef. But it's also completely fine if you don't want to say the note names and that you focus on trying to think of intervals, directions, and landmark notes as you play through each example. This also teaches our brains, our eyes, and our fingers to tie everything together. The only cardinal sin in these exercises is writing in every single note name and then playing while looking at the letters. That is the surest way to slow progress. If you want to write in the note names, please be sure to print out each page twice. A copy where you write the letters but never play from, and a clean copy that you use for practicing. Let's look at one more example for another way of how you can approach these little pieces. Here, we have a melody that you may recognize, but before you play anything, I want you to scan through the piece and do a mental checklist. Do you see any landmark notes? Well, we start on our landmark G, and we do see that note several times throughout the piece. What do you see happening with direction and intervals? We mostly have repeated notes and seconds, although there are also 2 thirds in this piece. Both times, the thirds are skipping up from the landmark G to B and then stepping back down. While I beg you not to write note names into your pieces, you can practice saying the note names before you play, which also gives you the chance to think about rhythm before you have to put all of the information together. So here, for example, we have G, 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 A, B2, A2, G, B, A, G2, 3, 4. Last but not least, let's take a quick look at Zone 1. Now, to be clear, the terms Zone 1, Zone 2, Zone 3 are not any sort of official terminology. It's something I made up for this boot camp just so that we're clear about targeting different sections of the bass clef. We want to learn systematically so that we can fully absorb all of the information. And I was very intentional in how I ordered these zones, as we're calling them. Most piano methods start around middle C and work their way down through the bass clef, with the unintended side effect of being fairly comfortable between our landmark F and middle C, but with our knowledge getting fuzzier the lower we move on the staff. We don't want that. We want to be bass clef superheroes. That's why we're here. So we're taking kind of the opposite approach. Today, we're starting at the bottom of the bass clef and covering the lowest 5 notes, from our landmark G up to D. This exercise is very friendly because we start with a landmark note and move all the way up and down through the zone in seconds before we mix in some thirds in the second row. Like we did with landmark notes, let's practice naming these notes together. I will kind of sing the pattern as I name the notes because I think it's useful to connect the sound of the intervals with what we see on the page. I'm very sorry in advance for my singing voice. Here we go. G, A, B, C, D, C, B, C, D, C, B, C, D, C, B, A, G, B, D, B, C, A, C, A, B, C, Now you know everything you need to complete this unit's assignments. Go through the workbook and sight read each exercise and melody. Keep a note of any difficulties if you have them. Be sure to complete both theory worksheets, but also feel free to do them on your own timeline. You can absolutely sit down and do both right away, but you can also divide them into sections and do 1 or 2 or 3 rows from each sheet per day. That's your call. Doing it all at once gives you an intensive experience that might help you drill these topics into your brain, but dividing them over a few days or even a week lets the ideas sink in a bit, and then you can test them in your progress each day. You can also use flashcards to test yourself as much as you want, and keep practicing the exercises and melodies if you wish, and be sure to keep an eye out for today's topics in the repertoire you're practicing. See if there are any places that you get hung up with reading where maybe you could use landmark notes or intervals to help you find your way more smoothly. Until next time, happy practicing.